What's up everyone, I'm Chirag and welcome to this video tutorial. So guys, in this video we are going to have a look at the partial batch response feature for the SQS as an event source to the Lambda function, which is kind of recently announced by the AWS. But before we go ahead and implement the partial batch response feature, let's have a look at different scenarios about how Lambda processes SQS message. Okay, so let's consider scenario 1, and here as you can see on my screen I have prepared a quick presentation to take you through all the scenarios that we are going to discuss throughout this video. So with scenario 1, we have an assumption that the SQS trigger is configured for the Lambda function, and here the exception handling is not in place in case of any SQS record processing failure for a given batch. Okay, so now let's say we have 5 messages in the SQS queue, and initially Lambda function got invoked with the batch of 2 messages, that is A and B. Now here A and B are processed successfully, and in this case Lambda will return the successful response, and once the successful response is returned from the Lambda function, those messages will be deleted from the SQS queue, right? And that deletion would occur automatically. Okay, now coming to the rest of the 3 messages. Now let's say the Lambda function got triggered with the batch of 3 messages again, and here we have an issue with processing one of the messages, right? And it failed. So for example, message E failed. Now in this case, since we don't have any exception handling in place, all the records, that means all the 3 records in this batch, would be available or would be kept back into the SQS queue for reprocessing, right? And these messages will be available for reprocessing once the visibility timeout period is over. Okay, so this was basically a scenario 1, right? So here what happened is that here we will kind of reprocess already processed record, right? That is D and C was already processed, but since message E or record E failed, the whole batch is kept back into the SQS queue for the reprocessing. And I think reprocessing already processed record is not feasible. So to avoid it at some level, let's have delete functionality in place, right? So what we are going to do is we will delete each record from the batch once it is processed. Okay, and that basically brings us to the scenario 2. So within scenario 2, again we have an assumption that the SQS trigger is configured for the Lambda function, and again the exception handling is not in place in case of any record processing failure. But here we will introduce the delete functionality so that after processing individual record from the batch, it gets deleted from the queue. Okay, now in scenario 2, we have 5 messages in the SQS queue, and let's say Lambda function got triggered with the first batch which has basically 2 records, right? And now it's processing message A, it is successful and it will delete it, and then it processed message B, again it is successful, and both the record or both the messages are deleted from the SQS queue. Now again the Lambda function got triggered with the rest of the messages, that is 3 messages in a single batch, right? Here now it's processing message C, and as you can see it's successful, so that message got deleted from the queue. Now here we have a problem with message D. Now Lambda is unable to process message D and there is an interruption. Now here, since we don't have exception handling in place, this is going to return some error, right? That means the Lambda is not successful. Now in this case, what will happen, both the messages, right, that is message E and message D, would be kept back to SQS queue for the reprocessing. Okay, so this was basically scenario 2. Now here what happened is that the Lambda function failed to process the third message, right, that is the third record, and due to that further processing of the rest of the records is interrupted. In this case it's the record E. Okay, but now let's say we want all the records to be processed once, right, even if any record is failing in between. And what we want to do is the successfully processed records should be deleted and only the failed records should be retried, right? Should be kept back to SQS queue for the retry. Okay, now that brings us to the scenario 3. So here again we have an assumption that the SQS trigger is configured for the Lambda function. Now here we are introducing exception handling for the failed records on top of the delete functionality. Okay, now here let's say again we have 5 messages. And what we will do is here we will maintain one flag to check if any of the records in the batch is failing or not. Okay, so let's say we have 5 messages in this scenario, and the Lambda got triggered with the first batch, that is A and B, and those are successful, so those messages are deleted from the SQS queue. Now again Lambda got triggered with the second batch which contains 3 records. Okay, and the C was successful and it is deleted. Now here the D is causing the error again. Now here, since we have exception handling in place, the lambda function is not going to interrupt the processing of rest of the messages, right? And it's not going to basically return an exception in this case at this point of time, right, while processing message D. Now let's say it's coming back to message E and it was successful, and hence it is successfully deleted from the queue as well. Now here in this case, what will happen, since message D is failed, the condition of the flag would evaluate to true, right? We will set the condition of that flag to true, and in that case we are going to raise an manual exception, for example the runtime exception, right? And that will basically put this record D back into the SQS queue for the retry, because we have already deleted the rest of the record, right, which was processed successfully. So that's the reason we only left with the record D, and that is something lambda function is going to put it back into the SQS queue for the reprocess or the retry. So this was basically scenario 3. So what we did in this scenario is that we added the exception handling functionality on top of the delete functionality. That means if each record is processed successfully, then we are going to delete that record, and in case of any failure for a particular record or message, then we are going to set the condition of the flag to true, right? And at the end we are going to check if the flag was true, then we are going to raise the manual exception, else we are going to return the status code 200 that lambda ran successfully, right? So in this case, only the failed record would be kept back to the SQS queue for reprocessing, right? But here if we look at the implementation, then we are adding the overhead of the delete functionality, right? And we don't want that. So basically the scenarios that we looked at, that means all the three scenarios were about how lambda can handle the records depending on the requirements before the partial batch response feature was introduced. Okay, so now let's understand what does partial batch response means and how it is beneficial. So basically with partial batch response failure feature, we can handle, or we can make the lambda function to identify the failed messages or records from the batch and return the identified records back to the queue, which will allow reprocessing of only failed messages or the asked messages. Okay. Now if we go ahead and compare this with scenario 2 and scenario 3, then here with the partial batch response feature, we will no longer need the delete functionality, and basically this will make the SQS queue processing efficient with increased throughput, and it also kills the need of repetitive data transfer, right, in terms of processing already processed message. And on top of that, it does not come with any additional cost beyond the standard price. Now let's quickly have a look at how partial batch response failure feature works. So let's say we have 5 messages in the SQS queue and lambda got triggered with the first batch with 2 records, and here let's say processing of message A is successful, and here we have an issue with the message B. So what we will do is we are going to record the message ID of message B, right, and append it to a list, and at the end of the processing what we are going to do is we are going to return the message ID back, right? So what it will do is it will push the message B back to the SQS queue for reprocessing, right, because we are returning the message ID of message B. So that's the reason it's going to keep message B back to the SQS queue for reprocessing. So now moving along, again the lambda function got triggered with the second batch which contains 3 records, and here message C is processed successfully. Now here we have an issue with message D. Now we are going to record the message ID of message D and append it to basically some list. Okay, and then we are going to process message E, and it is successful. So now as a response we are going to return the message ID of message D. So as a result it will put the message D back to the SQS queue for the reprocessing, right? So basically this is how the partial batch response failure feature works. Okay, now in this case let's say we also want to process already processed message, right? So that we can handle here as well. So we can return the message ID of whichever messages that we want lambda function to reprocess in this case. Okay, so basically this is how this feature works. So now let's go to our console and have a look at how we can implement this or how we can enable this feature. So navigate to AWS Management Console. So here we are. Let's navigate to Lambda Management Console. Here we are going to create the Lambda function. So say create function, give the function name. I will say SQS trigger partial, something like this. I will select runtime as Python 3.9. Within permission, I will let the lambda function create a new role for me, and then I will say create function. Now here one thing you need to keep in mind, that how should the response look like while you enable partial batch response failure feature. Okay, so to look at the response that we want to kind of maintain is, it looks something like this, right? So this is kind of the dictionary where we have batch item failures, and within each dictionary we are going to add item identifier followed by its ID. Okay, so this is the kind of response that we have to return while we are using a partial batch response failure feature. Okay, so now let's get back to our lambda function, and in the meantime we are going to create the SQS queue as well. So navigate to SQS service, and here we are going to say create a queue. We will select standard queue, give the queue name, I will say SQS partial, something like this, and I'm going to leave rest of the option as it is, and I will say create queue. And now here we have successfully created the SQS queue. As a next step, we are going to add a trigger on our lambda function. So go back to your lambda function, okay, say configuration, and say trigger from the left panel, say add a trigger. Within a trigger, select SQS, and within SQS queue select the SQS partial that I have just created, right? And I will leave batch size as 10 and batch window as 0, and then you need to click on the additional settings, and here you need to make sure that you check this report batch item failures to enable or to use that feature. Okay, and once you check that, say add, and this will add the trigger, right? And here we have an issue. It says an error occurred while creating the trigger. The provide acceleration does not hold a receive message. Okay, we need to provide the permission to that IAM role. So click on permission, open that role, right? And then here we are going to say attach policies. Here I will attach SQS. I will provide full access for now, but you can create the custom policy. Okay, and say attach policy. And once you provide the SQS access to this IAM role, we can go back to our lambda function and say add a trigger. Again, we need to perform same configuration, select the queue name, and make sure to click on additional settings and check report batch item failures and say add. Now once you add that, go to code. Okay, now here we are going to write some code, but I have already created a gist of that code. Here it is, and I'm going to copy this code and paste it over here, and I'm going to save it. I will say deploy. Okay, now here what I will do is I'm going to say print batch failure response. Okay, and then I will say deploy again. So let me quickly take you through this code. So here we are using two packages, that is JSON and Boto3, but I don't think we require Boto3 here. Okay, since we are not going to use it. Okay, so only one package, that is JSON. I think that also we don't require, but let it be. Now here on line number 4, we are checking whether there is any data in the event or not. And if there is a data, then we are creating two lists. Okay, one for messages to reprocess. So if any of the messages is failing, right, if any of the messages is not getting processed successfully, then we are going to record the message ID within this list. Okay, and then on line number 6 we have batch failure response variable, right, which is basically to define the structure that we want to return back. So that's basically a dictionary. And then on line number 7 we are iterating to the event of records, and then we have try and catch. Okay, try and accept. So here we are fetching the body, and here on line number 10 we can do some sort of processing that we want. We will come to that at later point of time, and if there is some error in processing this message, then it will trigger the exception, and within the exception we are appending the message ID along with some item identifier as a key. Okay, and then finally we are setting batch failure response, right, as a dictionary with the same format that we want to return. And finally on line number 15 we are going to print, is there any item in the batch failure response that we want this lambda function to reprocess it, right, just to get an idea. And then finally we are going to return that. Okay, so this is the very high level of the code, and I'm going to say deploy. Now apart from that, here I have one more lambda function. This lambda function will basically publish few messages. Okay, so that is M1, M2, M3, M4 and M5. These 5 messages will get published to this SQS queue that we have created. So the name of the SQS queue is SQS partial. Let me copy this and go back to SQS publisher and rename this, okay, and say deploy. Okay, I think now we are all set to test this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to publish few messages and then we will go back to the SQS trigger partial lambda function and have a look at the CloudWatch logs. Okay, but before we do that, let me also print body, okay, so that we should be able to see the messages that are coming from the SQS queue. Okay, so here I'm going to click on test and say test. Now this will publish these 5 messages. Okay, and it is successful. Let's go back to the SQS trigger partial, click on configuration, click on monitor, say view logs in CloudWatch. In the meantime, we can also have a look over here. Okay, here it is 00, and here we have the logs, 3 logs basically. Let's have a look at the first log. So here the M3 is processed as a single message, and then lambda got triggered with the batch of 2 records, okay, that is M2 and M5. Now since the 3 messages are processed, let's have a look at the rest of the 2 logs. So here it is, here the M4 is processed successfully, and then finally there should be M1. Okay, and as you can see, the batch item failures is empty, right, because none of the message were failed, right, while processing. So that's the reason it is empty. Now what we are going to do is let's add some error in this code. Okay, so here what we will say if body double equal to M1, okay, then we will say 1 divided by 0, right, and this is going to throw the division error. So let's say deploy. So whenever this lambda function will get triggered with the M1 as a message, right, it's going to throw an exception, and this will cause message 1 to be retried. Okay, and you would be able to see that message ID into this batch failure response. So now again, let's go back to our SQS publisher and say test, and here we go. So here if we have a look at that SQS partial, then you would be able to see message in flight, that is one message is in flight, right, because one message did not went through, right, went through the successful processing, so that's the reason it's in flight. But let's have a look at the logs. Let me reload this. So here we have another 3 logs. Let's have a look at the first one. M2 is successful, batch failure is empty. Okay, looks good. The second one, here we have M5 and M1, but here we have some issue, right? It says some message ID in the batch item failures. That means this message 1 have some issue and we want to retry it. Okay, now let's have a look at the third log, and here as you can see M3 and M4 are processed successfully, but again as you can see the M1 is again back here and it is failed again. So that's the reason the message ID is recorded, and this lambda function is going to retry it one more time. So as you can see M1 is processed again here, right, because it is failing for some reason. And if you look at the Amazon SQS queue, then you would be able to see one message is in flight as well. Okay, now if I simply remove this, right, if I simply comment this, okay, and say deploy, now when the lambda function will get triggered with the M1 message, it's going to process it successfully. Okay, so let's wait for that, and the batch item failure would be empty. Okay, so here it is, we have one more log. Let me click on that, and as you can see now batch item failures is empty and M1 is processed successfully. And if we have a look at the Amazon SQS queue, and if I reload this, then message in flight would be 0, message available would be 0 as well. Okay, so basically this is how we can control which message we want this lambda function to process again, okay, with the help of partial batch response failure feature. And guys, you can also have a look at this blog, right? So I had written the text version of this tutorial, and you would also be able to find the code for the relevant scenario. Okay, and here we have video as well. Okay, so guys, that's all I wanted to cover in this video. And till that time, if you want me to do tutorial on any use case or service, then please leave them below. and I will try my best to come up with a tutorial as soon as possible. And if you have any queries or comments, then again please leave them below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and see you next time.